Chapter 10. I travelled out to Karachi soon after the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War. Our agent's son was engaged to a charming Pakistani princess who seemed less than totally enthusiastic about her forthcoming arranged marriage. The agent and I lost money playing bridge at the local sports club. At the same club, one evening, the Pakistan Air Force was having a celebratory evening out. I was intrigued to find myself surrounded by men boasting of their achievements against the Indian Air Force, in a way that took me back to England in the 1939-1945 war. These Pakistani officers wore long moustaches, just had been the fashion in the RAF, and they talked with posh English accents, using terms such as old boy and wizard prang. It was impressive to hear of their successes, true I believe, and fun to hear the English public school voices. Perhaps they had indeed been to English public schools. I never found out. I also did some work that went well. Returning home, I discovered Dad had gone ill. To his delight, I visited him in All Saints Hospital, Chatham. He seemed quite disinterested in his illness, which I discovered was cancer. But he was certainly interested in the cribbage-playing abilities of his fellow patients. "These fellows are no good at cribbage," he said. He then raised his voice as he asked me about my Pakistan trip, just to make sure everyone in the ward understood what an important job I had. Visiting him on another occasion, I had been with him for less than an hour when he started fidgeting around, looking at his watch. "Don't you think it's time you were off back home?" he asked. I opened my mouth to reply, when through the door burst a female figure I recognized. She threw her arms around Dad's neck. "Ah, Gus," Dad's nickname, she gushed. "It was Ronnie." I left quietly. Soon afterwards, a doctor explained to me they had now found the cancer had spread to Dad's bones. Jane and I had the uncomfortable job of calling on Ronnie to tell her the news. He died on the 13th of March, 1967. Being his eldest offspring, I arranged his funeral, which was well attended by his friends and Osborne relations. One elderly lady relations spent some time talking to me, relating what a lad with the girls Dad had been in his young days. She also admitted with some embarrassment that she had a painter son who lived with another man. The son was Dennis Roxby Bott, a well-known watercolour artist. Jane and I went down to see some of Dennis's work in a studio in Sussex. It was impressive and enjoyable to look at. Dad had believed money was an important responsibility. He had spent much of his earnings on us all, and he was determined to be fair to his children when he died. Each time I met him, he would restate how much he expected to leave to us children. He had assessed what Mum would be worth when she died, and assumed she would bequeath this to Valda. To try to ensure each of us received an equal inheritance, he arranged that Richard and I would get 2/5 each of his money. Valda would receive 1/5. In the event, he had worked it out about right. As oil continued to grow in importance to the world, so Arabia grew in commercial importance to Coopers. I read The 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, an autobiography of his time as liaison officer with the Arabs against the Turks in the latter half of the 1914-1918 war. It was a fascinating read, and seemed to me to give the reader an important understanding of the history and complexities of the area. I told my team that each of them should read it to get a better understanding of that market. From this experience, I collected the belief that I should always read histories of any market that I was particularly concerned with. How else could one truly understand those markets, their peoples, As a foreign visitor, I would surely have an advantage over other exporters who did not have the same background knowledge of the country concerned. The last member in the group of the MacDougall family was Keith. He was besotted with Arabia, had spent his university vacations with the Bedouin, and was now in charge of exports to Arabia, reporting to PGH. Keith was a very bright young man, totally committed to his job. His letters to his agents invariably started with 2 or 3 pages of social guff before he got around to talking business. These close personal relationships started producing growing sales and profits. For example, it was said we had a contract to provide insecticide to be sprayed over Mecca to kill insects before the pilgrims arrived. It was even rumoured Keith had persuaded a member of the CTB to write a paper for a Saudi agent to help him get his PhD. Keith told me of the day one of his Arab agents came to his office with some embarrassment. An unmarried girl in his family was pregnant. Was there any way Keith could help her get an abortion? The agent asked. Keith rocked back on his chair in shock and embarrassment. Abortion was totally illegal in England, a serious crime. However, Keith was a resourceful lad. The MacDougalls had contacts everywhere. He rang a doctor in Harley Street and explained the position. "Well, of course, normally I wouldn't touch this with a barge pole, Keith," was the reply. "But since I have been friends for so many years with your family, send the girl along and at least I'll examine her." Keith heard no more until some time later when the agent came into his office with a broad grin on his face. The girl had gone to the doctor's surgery in Harley Street, where he had given her a thorough examination and then commented, "Yes, just about right, I think. I recommend a good long session on the Big Dipper." The Big Dipper was a roller coaster, a key feature of the Great Exhibition in London. In 1972, 5 children were killed when their train came off the rails. The Big Dipper was closed. Anyway, on this occasion, the result for this Arab girl had been just what was needed. In the products department, we had been looking at how we should be developing products, services for Arabia. My executive in charge of industrial sprays, Brian Walling, Cambridge economics graduate, had noted that the Lebanon was known in banking circles as the Switzerland of the Middle East. Tourists knew it as the Paris of the Middle East. Most Arabian banks were centered in Lebanon. Quite a proportion of Lebanon's population was Roman Catholic, and the country itself professed neutrality in the hostility that was simmering beneath Israel and Arabia. Lebanese businessmen were operating with increasing success around the world. So we came to the conclusion that the Lebanon would be ideal as a test market. Plans were drawn up to form a small subsidiary company, managed by a suitable youngster from our South African company. I visited the Lebanon in February 1967. We now had staunch agents there to support our planned company. They took me out one evening to a nightclub where German girls performed in cabaret. Very slightly they were too. 4 months later, 5th to the 10th of June, the Israelis attacked Egypt, Jordan and Syria in what became as the Six-Day War. The Arabs crumbled before Israel's military might and the surprise of the air and ground attacks. Israel gained control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Jerusalem, the Golan Heights. These were not Lebanon, but in Lebanon all buildings stopped. The nightclub girlies went home, and the country came to a halt. I realized our commercial decision might be sound, but politics could destroy the soundest plans. In Tring, besides Anne and John Sykes and Jenny and David Thallon, we had a CTB colleague of mine, an entomologist, Peter Brook, his wife Rosemary, and their 3 children, Nigel, Fiona, Flo, and Christopher Kipper, who were the same ages as R3. Peter was typical of the best CTB staff, so committed to his job that his work came first. He believed he was doing something worthwhile in the world, protecting food from insects. A few days after his marriage to Rosemary in 1957, he was in Morocco for 6 weeks, working on protection of stored grain from insects. Now, at the time of the 6-day war, he was on the bank of the Jordan River, then back at his hotel in Amman, where he met up with Sandy Gall, TV reporter. They filmed the Israeli air attacks from the roof of the hotel. One night, Peter decided the safest place to be was up to his neck in water in the outdoor swimming pool. Sandy's contacts got them evacuated out by air, a military Hercules, to Tehran. Some months later, after the hostilities had died down, I went back to Lebanon. The country was still in a state of shock, and, obviously, we had formed a subsidiary company at exactly the wrong time. I reported back to ALM that we should cut our losses and close the company. But ALM's pride was involved, and he just could not do it. 3 years later, when the company was closed, much more money had been lost. This taught me an important lesson. Never let a business decision be governed by pride. Back home, Dad's will arrangements were still causing troubles. He had told me Richard was to have his stamp collection, and I would have his watch with 2.5 engraved on the back, commemorating the £2.5 million loan stock he had been responsible for floating for the Rhodesian Railways. After Mum left him, he had pressured her into writing a letter renouncing any rights to his pension. Thus, during his life, he had enjoyed a larger pension. Now I had to look after Mum's financial position, which was not promising. I prepared carefully, planning to try to ingratiate myself with the Rhodesian Railways management in London to see what might be done. In the event, I was shown into the office of a manager who had been a great friend of the family during the 1939-1945 war. In no time at all, he reinstated Mum's pension rights as widow of the long-serving, successful employee, Dad. Most gratifying.